Hey, Mike with Nerd Problems Gaming here. In today's video, we'll be doing a review on Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origin, so let's get into it. Alright, so Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origin is more of a reimagining of the original Final Fantasy game that first came out on the NES. And so that's actually my favorite game of all time, and so to finally see a remake or reimagining of that game is really awesome, and I'm definitely excited about it. On top of that, the gameplay is incredibly addicting, and I've had a blast with it so far. I beat the main story, and so far I've been spending hours going through all the endgame stuff. But the general plot of the game follows the original Final Fantasy storyline, where you're playing as the Warriors of Light, and you go on a quest to stop 4 evil fiends and the ultimate evil Chaos that have been corrupting the crystals across the land, causing havoc across the world. And so you'll go on a quest to restore the crystals, defeat the fiends and Chaos, and to restore the land as it once was. So the general plot stays relatively the same throughout the game, so you'll visit lots of classic areas from the original Final Fantasy, encounter many of the classic enemies throughout the Final Fantasy series, like bombs and cactars and much more. On top of that, it really changed the overall formula of the original game, and instead of being more of a turn-based RPG, the game itself has become more of an action RPG, similar to installments from the Dark Souls series. Now, there's a lot of different elements that differ from the Dark Souls series, but just kind of that general feel of being a third-person action RPG is what carries over into this game. The game can be incredibly difficult as well. I'll come back to that later, but there are a bunch of different options and difficulty settings you can choose from. So if you want more of just a story experience, you can put it more of an easier mode. I played the first time through on the normal mode, and then after you beat the game for the first time, you'll unlock a chaos mode, which is even more challenging and has a lot of bonuses as well. Now, one thing that's a little bit different than, say, like a Dark Souls game is the fact that you'll go through a bunch of different missions based on different areas throughout the world map. And so each one of these missions will take you into a part of the world and kind of an interconnected map that's similar to like a Dark Souls map. But again, each of these maps doesn't interconnect throughout the entire world. You're just stuck at that specific location to go through that mission. And so as you'll explore, you'll enter new rooms. Occasionally you'll find keys to unlock new doors and areas. There's often hidden branching paths that you can find. And throughout this, you'll go up against classic monsters from the Final Fantasy series and eventually face off against an intense boss from the original Final Fantasy. Now again, a lot of these bosses will have unique attacks and abilities, and you'll really need to use all of your skill sets to get past them. And so a neat feature of this game, like I had mentioned, is that it's an action RPG, and so you'll really be able to customize your character with a bunch of different job classes. And so there's all kinds of different job classes to choose from. A lot of them come straight out of the first Final Fantasy game, but others have definitely been thrown into the mix from later entries in the Final Fantasy series. So again, you'll start off with things like a warrior and a thief, a white mage and a black mage, but eventually you'll be able to unlock more advanced job classes and even expert job classes as you master the different jobs. And so each job will have a unique skill set, unique abilities. You'll unlock new combos that you can use. Each one allows you to use different weapon types as well. Another neat aspect about the game is the fact that you're going to find all kinds of different weapons and armor. And so many of these, again, are classic to the Final Fantasy series, and so it's really cool to see many of these come to life. You know, there's different weapons that I remember picking up and finding throughout the original Final Fantasy game, and getting to see them in awesome graphics was really cool. On top of that, another neat thing is that all of the equipment that you collect throughout the game alters how your character looks. And so I definitely feel like that's kind of a standard these days, but it's really neat to see that. Because again, they have some of the classic costumes from the original Final Fantasy made up in current day gen graphics, which is really fun to see. On top of that, it's really great to go to these locations that I remember from the original Final Fantasy, seeing them totally remade in today's graphics. That was a ton of fun to experience, and I really enjoyed that as well. Another thing that's really cool is that you're constantly going to be finding new items when you defeat enemies. And so as you kill enemies, they'll drop items. Often will be different weapon types and armor types. And each one of those items has a level associated with it, but also a rarity as well. And so you'll find yourself finding hundreds of items throughout the course of the game that you can then dismantle for new items that you can use to upgrade weapons at the smithy, adding in additional abilities to better suit your playstyle. On top of that, the armor and weapons will have an affinity bonus for various different job types. And so this allows you to really customize your equipment to best utilize the job that you're using. And depending on how much affinity you have with that specific job type, it'll grant you additional abilities as well. I didn't personally find myself diving into that element a lot. I typically would just use the auto equip that equip the best equipment overall, but it can get really detailed if you want to dive into it and really customize your equipment and enhance its abilities as well. The game also features intense combat, and depending on the type of weapon that you're using, they each all have their own unique abilities. So for example, some of them you can chain together with different combos. You have a regular attack and a heavy attack. You can block attacks, and you can also do sort of a magic absorption attack to block incoming enemy attacks. And when you do this, if you time it just right, sometimes you can absorb specific abilities from enemies, and it also will fill up and potentially increase your magic gauge as well. And so this magic gauge allows you to use special abilities that you'll learn as your job classes progress, or to unlock unique abilities throughout your combos as you're attacking enemies. And so this is really cool where, again, you might use it to cast spells if you happen to be a white mage or a black mage. So you could be healing your characters, casting haste on everybody, or using a variety of different spells against enemies to capitalize on their weaknesses. And so this creates some challenging dynamics, and that's one element I love and also hate about the game as well, is that occasionally you'll come across bosses and enemies with an incredible difficulty spike. For example, the first major boss you encounter is Tiamat, which is one of the 4 fiends from the original game, and it was super cool getting to face off against it. But I had to have died at least 30 times or more against this boss, which was definitely frustrating. And so you really need to master the mechanics if you ever hope to beat this game. And so early on, I was able to just really plow through enemies without much skill or much thought into it, using the most basic combos. But as I progressed, you really need to take advantage of blocking enemy attacks, using that absorption technique where you can absorb certain attacks to give yourself magic back. And you'll likely need to be a lot more strategic than you might think going into the game to actually progress and get far. But I definitely found after getting past that first Tiamat battle, while that did take forever and I died dozens of times, once I really figured out the high level mechanics of the game, which needed to happen to get past that boss, the rest of the game wasn't as challenging. And I really found once I had built that foundation skill set, I was really able to progress through the rest of the game very quickly. So again, for some people that might be frustrating, but for others that might be some of the appeal to the game as well. Now one thing is that I don't want to get too heavy into spoiler territory, but there's definitely a huge twist at the end of the game that I didn't see coming and really just blew my mind. I definitely got goosebumps when I reached the end of the game and had that reveal in the story. That was super awesome. So I definitely recommend playing it through to the end of the game, especially if you're a fan of the original Final Fantasy. I think you'll definitely appreciate it a lot more, but that really took this game to a whole new level for me. Another thing that's really cool is that after you do beat the game, you unlock the Chaos difficulty. And so with that, now at each different mission throughout the game, there's a ton of different difficulty settings that you can unlock, each one with a progressively harder level difficulty. And by beating these difficulties, you'll unlock the ability to break through the level cap of your various different jobs. You'll get higher level equipment as you go, and you get that additional challenge, which adds to the replay value even further. For me, I'm about 80 hours into the game at this point. I beat it through the first time, and I've been going through the different chaos level challenges, but I definitely feel like you could probably get a couple hundred hours in trying to beat all of the different challenges and beating it through to get the best equipment and unlock the hardest levels throughout the game. Now, one thing that was a little bit frustrating for me was the music. And so the game does have some good music, but being a fan of the Final Fantasy series for so many years, playing through basically every game that was ever made in the Final Fantasy series, it seemed like they recycled some of the songs from later Final Fantasy games into this game. And being kind of a remake of a sense of the original Final Fantasy game, I was really hoping that they would go through and remaster a lot of the music or bring it up to today's standards in this game, but I only saw that happening a couple times throughout the game. So I feel like that was kind of a missed opportunity in the game, that they should have brought over more of the original game music. That's part of what I really love about the game, and seeing it remastered in that as well would have been awesome. A couple other things I was a little bit frustrated with is that you really only control one main character throughout the game. It makes sense as the storyline slowly evolves and unravels, and while there are some customization elements to the other players in the game, giving them different job classes, equipping different equipment on them, it wasn't as extensive as your main player. And so I would have liked to have seen maybe a little bit more customization with those people to maybe better suit your strategy or to compensate for maybe weaknesses that your main character might have depending on the job class you're choosing. Sometimes also, the AI controls of the other characters are pretty stupid, where you might be wanting them to focus on a specific enemy to keep them away from you so you can beat another enemy, but sometimes that doesn't happen, and so again, it can be frustrating at some points feeling like you're alone, even though you do have multiple characters helping you. But that didn't happen a lot, it was just sometimes as I played throughout the game, and so as you play, it might be something to be aware of. Now again, if you like action RPGs or games like Dark Souls, I would definitely recommend this, especially if you're a fan of the Final Fantasy series. There's all kinds of different tie-ins to the various equipment and locations and monsters from the first Final Fantasy, but also later games in the series as well. I definitely think the game is a lot more forgiving than the Dark Souls series, so you'll probably not have as much frustration as you might in one of those games to really get good at it. But again, there's a couple bosses throughout the game that might leave you incredibly frustrated until you figure out how to get past them. But overall, this is one of the most addicting games I've played recently. It's quickly becoming one of my favorite Final Fantasy games in the series, and I definitely think it's a must-play for action RPG fans, especially if you're a fan of the original Final Fantasy. The endgame storyline is amazing, and I definitely recommend picking up this game. And if you guys like this video, be sure to smash that like button as it really helps out the channel. And if you like videos like this on video games, board games, and everything nerdy, check out one of our other videos here. And if you haven't done so yet, be sure to subscribe and turn on the bell notifications to get the latest updates of new nerd videos we put out. But once again, thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you more soon.